Hello everyone. Today we shall study the poem Hunger by Jayanta Mahapatra. It was first published in 1976 in A Reign of Rights. Now, Mahapatra's poetry is complex in its directness of addressing the subject. Mahapatra himself talks a great deal about his poetry. For instance, in an interview to the Sunday Observer on May 27, 1984, he observes, "When I started writing poetry, I thought it would be a safe and private business. Now everything seems changed. The years have only instilled in me a different sense of the requirements of poetry. I am aware, fully aware, that my poems deal with the life within myself, where the mind tries to find a sort of coherence from the mass of things in the world outside it." So he seeks a coherence between what happens inside and what happens outside. And it is this poetics of Mahapatra that is reflected in his poetry. However, there is another dimension as well, which is predominantly present in most of Mahapatra's poetry and very conspicuously in his poem Hunger, which is the politics of hunger. Talking about the politics of his poetry, Mahapatra writes, "Where I live today and lived almost all my life, I know there is much suffering that erupts out of many causes, mainly economic and social, and such suffering becomes my secret ground, turns into the risk of secret quality of my poems." So you see, there is a secrecy, there is a politics, there is an economic cause which makes the poet feel distress, which causes the poet suffering, and it is out of this suffering that his poetry is born. Now, Hunger, the title is very significant because it talks about two kinds of hunger. The first is the physical kind, the fleshly kind, in which we long for food, because the poor people primarily suffer from hunger, and hunger is a chronic disease all over the world today. But there is also another kind of hunger, which is the hunger of carnal desires, which is the hunger of sexual pleasures. So Mahapatra talks about both kinds of hunger. And we shall see as we go on that how these two are intertwined on the planes of his aesthetics, his poetics, his economics, his politics, and so on and so forth. So let's read the poem without further ado. "It was hard to believe the flesh was heavy on my back." The poem begins with a conscious consideration of the flesh, the longings of the flesh, the carnal desires being heavy on his back. That is, he is, and by he I mean the speaker, not Mahapatra himself. The speaker is feeling a heavy load of his carnal desires on him. The fisherman said, "Will you have her?" carelessly. So there is a fisherman to whom the speaker is talking to, and the fisherman acts as an intermediator, as a pimp, if I am allowed to say that word. And he talks to the speaker, and they are going towards the fisherman's hut, where the speaker, who is the customer, shall have the fisherman's daughter. And look, the fisherman says, "Will you have her?" And look, when we are talking about the character of the fisherman who serves as a pimp, a mediator, it becomes very curious, because number one, Mahapatra talked mainly about Odisha, where there are many fishermen due to the proximity of the sea. So it's a very common sight for him. Number two, the fisherman catches fish by laying baits and finally reeling in his nets. So, in between the baits and the nets, the fish are caught. And over here we have the similar imagery because the customer too is taking the bait of the girl available for physical pleasures. And there is perhaps a third reference. The reference is perhaps to The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, where we have the figure of the Fisher King who received a wound in his loin, and his wound reciprocated through his land, and his land had become barren. So, here we have a psychological, emotional barrenness which is desperately attempted to be abated by a physical fertility. Anyway, will you have her is a very curious expression because having someone is the common idiom for the sexual intercourse. But simultaneously, in Christian marriages, we say, will you have and hold her for better or for worse? So here, there is no question of holding, of only having remains. Therefore, there is no sanctity in this sexual activity. Carelessly. Now, carelessly comes at a very interesting juncture. Carelessly can go with will you have her, or carelessly can go with trailing his nets and his nerves. Look, it is preceded and followed by a comma, respectively. But if we add it with will you have her carelessly, then the hold talks about the omission of the holding part, that is will you have her and not hold her, that is carelessly. That is, the lover does not feel any emotion towards the girl apart from the sexual hunger that he suffers from. And if I say carelessly trailing his nets and his nerves, then we can realize that the fisherman is undecided whether this deal will be on or not. And he is worried in a sense. Plus, trailing his nets and his nerves, that is, there is a lot going on in his head, on his nerves, but simultaneously he is slowly trailing his nets to put on the bait of his daughter and reel in the customer, that is the fish, as though his words sanctified the purpose with which he faced himself. So, look here, Mahapatra uses a very interesting expression, as though his words sanctified. Since there was no sanctity in the sexual activity, his words are necessary to sanctify the purpose with which he faced himself. Now, he has come here to sell the body of his daughter for sexual pleasures, to attain some money, to gain some money, which will, for the time being, abate his poverty. So that is the purpose for which he has come, and that purpose needs to be sanctified at any cost. And all the social, moral, custodial taboos that are functioning in all of us do not mean anything when the question of hunger arises. And look, he has to face himself. So it's not like that he does not suffer from shame, he does not suffer from ignominy, but he has to face himself knowing fully well that he is selling his daughter to make the ends meet. I saw his white bone thrash his eyes, and you see, as a pimp, he has to convince the customer that she is a good buy, that is, his expenditure on her would not be wasted, and therefore, in order to take the customer in confidence, he is smiling. The white bones refer to the teeth. But what happens is that his eyes, the other white of his body, are actually betraying him. Almost his white teeth, while laughing at the customer, are chastising him. There's a split in him. On the one hand, you see EYES and I in its plural sense, that is eyes, that is the multiple eyes that we are as split selves. these things spun. So what happens is that the father's self is almost chastising the pimp self. The father's self is almost chastising the poor man's self. And there is nothing that this father can do. I followed him across the sprawling sands. Now, this sentence is very interesting because this sentence brings the time and space, the matrix of time and the matrix of space together. How? For instance, sands refer to the beaches, that is the expanse that the customer or the speaker has to follow this pimp to reach to his heart. But simultaneously, we talk about sands of time. You will see that when something is both exciting and shameful, that is, for instance, say we have bunked the class and we have gone to watch cinema, and suddenly there's a call from home that where are you, and you have to return now as early as possible. Now this time, this specific time, that is when you are hurrying up, that okay, my parents do not know I have to return, and this time is very crucial because then you can meet the time and space meet. Or imagine you have to go to college in the morning and suddenly all the signals are red, and you can feel that the time and space are meeting together and conspiring against you. But in any case, I followed him across the sprawling sands, my mind thumping in the flesh's sling. Sling is a kind of contraption. When our arms or legs break, then we wear a kind of cloth over the plaster so that our arms can rest from the neck and so that our arms do not dangle. So that's almost like a sling. And you see my mind thumping in the flesh's sling as if the entire fleshly desire is adding up to the mind's incessant beating. Thumping means a kind of loud beat. So my mind is thumping in the excitement and ignominy. In the flesh's sling, hope lay perhaps in burning the house I lived in. Now, the shame is catching up so quickly because of the taboo that he is going to indulge into, that his only hope is perhaps in burning the house that he lived in, because house is the most sanctified place. And you see, we often compare our body with the house, our mind with our house. We often compare certain people with our house. That is, some people feel like home and our body feels like our home. Our body is our home. So it's almost like he wants to burn himself. He wants to burn every consideration of house that he has, because he is going to forcefully enter into somebody else's house through dint of his money, and he is going to cause a lot of turmoil over there through the act of sexuality. So since there is no peace outside, there should not be any peace inside as well. Now, this objective correlative, or as Jayanta Mahapatra calls him, whatever goes on inside and whatever goes on outside, this thing sets in over here. Silence gripped my sleeves. Now, all of these happenings are going on in his mind, and he is bodily silent. So, silent gripped my sleeves. His body clawed at the froth his old nets had only dragged up from the seas. So while silence claws the customer's sleeves, all that touches this fisherman is perhaps the froth or the foam that is attached to the net from the seas. It's a very common part of the fisherman's everyday catch. That is, with the fish come the foam. In the flickering dark, his heart opened like a wound. The wound is not a simple thing. The wound is both a psychological wound of the customer as well as a kind of physical wound or a psychological wound of the fisherman, the wound for the father who is selling his daughter, and the wound for the customer who is about to forcefully enter another girl's body, another girl's house. The wind was I. So, just like the wind opens the door, similarly, here, the flickering dark, in the flickering dark, his heart opened like a wound. So, there's a lot of memory play over here as well. Because you see, in the next line, he writes, and the days and nights before. So, for the girl, this is nothing new. She has the memory in on her body of the wounds that she has received from the various customers, both psychological and physical wounds. Palm fronds scratched my skin. Palm fronds are palm leaves through which the thatches are made of the houses. So, as if the house is trying to resist. You see, there is a very sexual innuendo over here because the palm frond scratching my skin and the entering of the house as someone's body, these things talk about the sexual encounter as well. Inside the shack, an oil lamp splayed, the hours bunched to those walls. Now, all that he remembers are various disjointed images, heaps of broken images in that house where he had that sexual encounter with her, and their moving bodies were almost like painted on the walls over those hours. Over and over, the stickly suit crossed the space of my mind. So, when there is a lamp, there is soot, the thick black ink generated by the lamp. And all that remains of that sexual encounter for this man, all that shall remain, is the soot, the darkness, the blackness of the encounter itself. He'll forever keep on blaming himself. I heard him say, my daughter, she's just turned 15. And look, there's an ellipsis, three dots, which is an ellipsis, that is, the rest of it is either a pause or there's something else that cannot be told, and you must feel, you must understand. So the fisherman says that his daughter has turned only 15, so you can understand what poverty has forced them to do. That is, how poor they are, so that he has to sell his 15 years old daughter's body for sexual pleasure of others so that they can earn money. Feel her. And you see, it's in these two words, you can already see a collapsing father and a very problematized customer, because he has to feel her. He has to feel her 15-year-old body. So, almost like the 15-year-old was a sign that you're supposed to feel her but be gentle. I'll be back soon. Your bus leaves at 9. So, he is making him aware of the time that he has, and there is a gentle reminder of feeling her and not just having sexual intercourse. That is, feel her pain perhaps. The sky fell on me and a father's exhausted while. So, the sky fell on me is a very common example, a very common idiom in India. And a father's exhausted while. Why is the while exhausted?